Unless we get into an argument, then it's like from.
Welcome back to Capacity Asia 2021. This session is our State of the Market China, the drive towards sustainability. Before we begin, I would like to thank our sponsor of this session, Chayora, for their help bringing together all of these panelists and making the event possible. If you have any sort of follow-up questions after the session, or you just want to say hi to the team, why don't you pop by their virtual meeting area and say hi to James and co. It'd be great to get any audience questions throughout the session through the chat function, which we'll pass on to the speakers, so please feel free to ask any questions. We've got a great group of speakers for this session today, including our moderator, James McCartney, who's the Executive Vice President of Sales for Chayora. Over to you, James.
Thank you, James, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. You know, these days of virtual events, we never quite know where everybody is situated whilst we're presenting from our various places around the world. So thank you for taking the time to join us this morning. We've got an excellent panel. And so to start with, what I'd like to do is just go round the panel and we'll sort of work along as you know, those people. So we'll ask Susanna for a quick few minutes of introduction, Dedric and Connie in that order. So without further ado, I'll hand over. Then we'll come back, we'll set the scene a little bit around what we're going to discuss and a little bit of background around sustainability and what's happening in China and also elsewhere. And then we'll sort of go into the sort of Q&A sessions as we move forward. So over to Connie to introduce yourself, please.
Hello, thank you, James. And yeah, I'm ConneeZhang from CypressTel. So CypressTel is a major focus in the Asia Pacific area, and I'm also in the industry for the more than 20 years. We major provide SD-WAN and cloud connectivity and data center managed bases in Asia Pacific area. And so that's so happy to join this panel discussion. Thanks, James. And yeah, okay.
Great. Thank you. And Susanna?
Hello, everyone. My name is Susanna Kass. I'm dialing in from Bay Area, California, USA. So good morning to you all. In my role as a data center advisor for the UN Sustainable Development, I represent the UN SDG Goal program by engaging private sector and also public sector to jointly promote sustainable energy within the international data center sector and the global industry. So through mutually beneficial collaboration and goal setting, we work on projects that are in gigawatt, and I'm also an energy fellow and lecturer at the School of Engineering at Stanford University. I work with many startups. One of them is dear to my heart is InfoPrime, who is leading the European Union Clean Energy Standard. In my commercial experiences, I spent 30 plus years in the data center industry. Asia is dear to my heart as I was the COO for eBay International and the EVP for base layer, and certainly have cited over 200 megawatt of data center from the grounds up in terms of building data center across 17 countries. So glad to be here today. So thanks for having me, and back to you, James.
Thank you. And on to Dedric as well, who's also joining us from China.
Thanks, James. Dedric is my name. I'm based out of Shanghai in China. I'm the business unit director for North Asia for DCS, which is Data Solutions, a business within CBRE. Our business, we focus on the project management of the construction and fit out of data centers, as well as the facility operations of large hyperscale data centers all the way to enterprise data centers. We sort of put people in your data centers so that they run the right way. My background comes from various different aspects. I've worked with the operators. I've worked with a media company like Euromoney around data centers. So I've got a 10,000 foot view of this industry. Back to you, James.
All right, great. So look, that gives you a little bit of context of who's talking, and so some great experience with us on the panel today. So what we're going to do is we're going to work through a number of topics. So please do put your questions up in the chat as we go through. And those topics are going to be looking at the industry trends that we're seeing, an analysis and opportunity, and we'll take some views as well to start with from Susanna around, the sort of outcome and what the view is after COP26 that was held in Glasgow earlier this year, which will be fascinating, I think, and we'll look at both the international as well as what's happening in China. We'll then look at more of a specific angle around China. So what's happening around sort of the Beijing, Shanghai legislation and the PUE and efficiency, and what data center operators are trying to achieve there. And then power consumption, there's a huge demand in China at the moment. When we look at the drive from both the 5G network and if I can just quote from a Greenpeace report, which if you're interested in sustainability is a fascinating read, and not too long, right, which is always a benefit. They actually did some research, and China is on track to increase by an estimated 289% its electricity consumption by 2035. So it's absolutely critical that we think about sustainability. And that's also very dear to the heart of the Chinese government, which is critical and central to its 14th, its 5-year plan, right? Current 5-year plan, which is running from 2021 to 2025. And they're setting some pretty strong goals around, how they're going to be sustainable across all digital infrastructure, as well as sustainable construction all the way through what's happening in the country. And then the challenges of power, we'll look at, the responsibility of suppliers and customers to position sustainability as a key to our customers as well. So that's kind of the flow of the meeting. And what we'll do is we'll actually start off. So I'll come to you, Susanna, just to give us a view. And we discussed earlier about some of the global trends and specifically some of those trends looking at China, but also the views from COP26. What's come out of there? Should we be excited from the results of COP26, or should we be slightly disappointed? I've kind of heard differing views, so great to get some inputs.
Thank you, James. That's a lot of topic to cover, but let me try. I am a computer scientist, for those of you who listen in, so I have a tendency to focus more on the scientific evidence of what happened in the event like COP26. Indeed, if you're not familiar with it, I guess most of you may heard of the global warming level that we're trying to keep it under 2 degrees C, which is part of the Paris Agreement. And I am glad to make the report or the Paris Covenant available to James and Chayora for anybody who wanted to basically do a download for a follow-up. So you can actually read it at your own leisure to make your own conclusion, whether you should celebrate or you should be very sad, okay? For me, I think today, it's best to focusing more on the data and the scientific evidence, James, so we can act on it. Some of you may not be familiar with this organization called IPCC. It stands for Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It is the body in the United Nations to assess science related to climate change. And we work together as a working group for researchers, energy fellows like myself, scientists, that basically lead science-based assessment, and we share results in terms of reports to the head of state level and to the industry. And so this is really relevant as my role as a data center advisor. What we basically do is the COP26 event in Glasgow, I would say, is a celebratory event. There are many countries indeed step up to make very bold ambition and corporate pledge and carbon neutrality. So that is very important. When I first started in the Sustainable Development Program, that wasn't really that long ago, maybe a decade ago. As much as I have been spending 30 years in my career in data center, most of my colleagues and they are all hyperscaler, so all the branded one, they haven't even heard of it. And Dedric probably got too busy focusing on doing what his career, And he probably won't be able to tell me there are 17 global goals. Connie probably will be able to tell me because, given the fact that she's a founding of her own company, she's very data driven. So she probably have heard of it, but most of the folks may not be. You're too busy focusing on the things. So, but I would say COP26, James, is very exciting. It's more like which company are now not making a carbon neutral or carbon positive pledge. So it is completely an inverse in a very short period of time. So that part of it, I have to say positive, that it is indeed very exciting. Now, I'll let you be the decision maker to decide whether achieving a carbon negative goal by 2030 is better than 2050, because we are genuinely running out of time from a sense of urgency perspective. So folks like myself, who is more a researcher and a scientist, and we set science-based target to tackle climate change on hyperscale and mega hyperscale. One of the most important innovation that came out from the COP26 and the working group is this thing called the Interactive Atlas. So it is available. If you want to go to ipcc.org, the interactive map is very relevant to our data center industry, James, because it showed the flexibility for spatial and temporal analysis of where potentially we could be siting the next data center by giving you very relevant data center infrastructure information that when I was a CEO at eBay, I wasn't really able to get that when I was siting and building across different 17 countries. And then one of the most specific thing, because I know we're talking about Asia today, is there is a wide variety of emission level from Asia West versus Asia East in terms of where you're going to be siting your data center. And a lot of that information is available in this interactive map that we are making available through the COP26. Each of these data index is actually correlated with a climate impact driver. So you actually don't have to read any report. They are all interactive. So citing a 2 megawatt versus a 200 megawatt data center in terms of the behemoth versus a 2 megawatt, which is really big actually from an edge data center perspective, makes a difference. And it's very helpful to actually have the tool to be able to do a climate impact driver. For some of you want to kind of have a test drive or do a demo, just send me a note on LinkedIn, we'll connect, and I can walk you through it. So the important trend, I would say, James, that I think we need to take a sense of it is an urgency, okay? Nothing to get depressed about, because indeed it is a journey. It is a journey that we're all taking, but I have to admit that being a scientist and being in a data center industry for 30 years, there's a bias towards action. Ambition is important. It really inspires all of us and elevates us to a whole level that we are all connected like we are doing it today, regardless which country we're in or which time zone. But when we start understanding the consequences of our design, build, and operate, where Dedric is an expert, I'm sure we will learn a lot from him later today. And Connie is also an expert in terms of connectivity and how it affects service level and user experience. We have to consider beyond just the boundary of the data center, be it a wall, a modular panel, or the fences of our data center, physical boundary. We need to start thinking about the consequences from a social responsibility perspective. And if nothing else you gain from me, I'd like you to remember the trend is we have to embrace energy ethics. So try to figure out what is the energy ethics that you're going to be incorporating. What is your social cost of responsibility beyond just your total cost of ownership for per megawatt installed in your ROI analysis? So those are some of the important trends that we think is important. We are pushing for the grid being 24/7 green, James. That is one of the important trends. We are pushing for the grid to be 24/7, even though there's a lot of wonderful technologies such as fuel cell, lithium-ion battery, hydrogen, and I got involved in all of them already and building probably over 200 megawatt of these clean energy generation used for on-premise clean energy, because we all have to learn how to adapt and work with a grid, regional grid that is not 24/7 green or 24/7 reliable for that matter. I mean, you should all feel very sorry for me, because I actually from Silicon Valley, and I am actually working on one of the most unreliable grid And because of all the fire that, that's going on, and they don't even announce a blackout for us anymore. It just happens, and you're out. And this is like Silicon Valley, unthinkable. So being in data center, as Dedric and Connie will educate us as expert later on, and James, of course, as well, being in Chayora, is the fact that we need simultaneous, resilient, and sustainability in our businesses. So I would say COP26 Glasgow can always be better if we can hear more about actual action than just the bold carbon neutral commitments. But we got to start somewhere. And I think it's a good place to start, that everybody is aware. And indeed, James, I think you mentioned a little bit earlier, there was discussion about accountability in terms of accounted for what emission level we have before we actually build a data center. So you would expect that actually will be happening. I don't know how active Asia is going to do that, but I believe Singapore will actually start taking the lead in that regard, that you cannot just go build any data center and just emit any kind of emission. You need to incorporate that in order for you to get the permit. And so I think be able to capture the emission, reduce it, reuse the emission using the technology, including the waste. We then all live, have to ditch this concept of a linear economy, because we have to keep these resources in perpetual use, so we can allow to give benefits to this industrial community cluster. So I would say these are the key trends for the data center. So back to you, James.
There's a really interesting one, just before I come on to Dedric and Connie for some comment of what they're actually seeing in China. But you mentioned energy ethics, right? And yes. Just so I understand exactly what you mean by that, you're talking the social responsibilities of organizations, not only for how they build and they manage their supply chain, but also about how they procure data center assets, correct? Is that where
correct.
That is? So, I mean, this will be interesting. I know Dedric, from his business at CBRE, there's a lot of work around the project management. So I suppose coming over to there's two questions for you, Dedric, and I know I should never ask multiple questions, but there are two which I want to get out whilst I'm thinking about it.
Write this down.
One is what are you actually seeing on the ground, right? Are you seeing this idea or this view of energy ethics? I know you guys, support facilities management for a number of US international companies in China. I'm keen to understand, are they really, and these are companies that we're not going to talk about, but we all know who they are, right? Or some of this. But I suppose my question is, what are you seeing on the ground, Dedric? And are you seeing your customers wanting to potentially pay the extra to actually jump on board with that energy ethics concept, right? Or are they actually saying, it's a nice idea, but actually we want the cheapest price for data center per kilowatt per megawatt that we can get? What are you seeing?
This is a very, in my mind, and maybe not to the audience, but in my mind, this is a very leading question, right? Because the behaviors of enterprises and hyperscalers are fundamentally commercial, right? And what I'm seeing in China is that it's not so much energy ethics, but the energy ethics is built into the market that they're operating in, right? So it's not an individual company initiative, it's just in the environment. And sort of that leads to the question that you're asking regarding whether or not decisions are being made around price. Well, they are going for high quality, lowest price, right? But what's happening within the regulation environment is that lowest price is becoming the ethical option, right? So a large part of, and you mentioned Singapore, Susanna. So Singapore is currently going through a moratorium where you cannot build new data centers, right? While the government works out what to do. And back in 2018, we learned, in Beijing, you cannot build a data center unless the PUE was under 1.4, right? And in that kind of environment, the first reaction I had when I heard about that is like, how are you measuring the PUE, right? At what time of the year are you taking that measurement? Are you taking it aggregated across the year? Are you taking it in the middle of winter, in the middle of summer, right? How are you determining whether or not that design spec is going to meet that PUE PUE quota or TUE target. Now, what we're hearing lately, especially in Beijing, is that the government has caught on how data centers operate. Right? So they're adjusting that regulation, they're changing the regulation. So still, unless you hit those quotas, right, you're not allowed to build. You don't get the regulation, you don't get the permit to build, but they are scaled based on the scale of the data center. They're not just measuring energy consumption, they're measuring coal-fired energy consumption, right? Which means that if you consume a certain amount of coal-fired energy in the market, then you're going to attract a tariff on top of your energy bill, right? Which makes it more expensive for you to run a data center that's not green or not progressively green, right? And I think it's almost a parental approach to the data center industry because it's such a large market, right? There are so many data centers in so many different forms. I'm still I've worked in the Asia Pacific region for about a dozen years in the data center sector. And if you go back to the late 2010s, 2009, 2008, there were still standalone enterprise data centers, but in the rest of the world and the rest of Asia, they don't exist anymore. They're all in co-location facilities. In China, they still exist, right? Which means that you've still got banks who are running standalone facilities, and they're seeing this change in the legislative landscape, and they're going, what do? Right? How do I get this? I'm not an operator. I'm not a hyperscaler, right? I'm not a co-location company. I'm not a telco. I'm a bank. How do I get my energy efficient to the level that meets regulation? And to answer your question in terms of this ethics aspect of it, their behavior is in line with the energy ethics. It's just the motivations aren't, right? And so it's almost the ends justifies the means in that creating the structure to get companies who are running large facilities, consuming a lot of energy, to opt towards renewable sources, opt towards sustainability, because it's economically viable, it's less troublesome, it allows you the permits, right, to operate, right? And the most recent thing that I learned is that first initial response I had in terms of how are you going to measure PUE is part of the new Beijing regulation is that when you're designing your data center, you have to include the monitoring equipment, right? That is linked to the government system, right? Which means that visibility is becoming more and more transparent. It's very easy to report your PUE in the middle of winter, right? Right, when all the cooling infrastructure is just open the windows. But when it's linked to the government system and they can track your energy consumption, they can track the performance of your data center across the year, then there's no ability to obfuscate the performance of your data center, which is, what that tells me is that because of this 15th five-year plan, the government has educated themselves to understand the infrastructure that's consuming the most electricity. And we're probably going to go from a 2% of the total energy consumption of China from data centers by 2035, I think we're reading the same report, is going to be 6 or 7% of the total consumption, which is, increasing a lot. If we don't sort of put a cap on how that energy is being sourced, then we're going to have that environmental outcome that Susanna sort of mentioned that we need to be working on might not be as positive going forward. I hope that's a roundabout way of answering your two questions.
Yeah, I think it's great, and I think Susanna, you mentioned earlier, is it important to complete this sort of change by 2030 or 2050? I think China's actually made a statement that to be carbon neutral by 2060. Not exactly sure what exactly that means for an entire nation, but Connie, I'm keen to continue this thought of the energy ethics, because I think this is really, really important, and I love that. It's now my newest favorite phrase, Susanna. But I'm keen to continue this. You're the CEO of an organization. So I want to understand what you're seeing on the ground in China as well, and also what you're experiencing with your customers. Are they interested in in your company's sustainability pledges and promises, and what are you doing? What are you saying?
Thanks to you, James. And it's Susanna and Dedric, they talk about that the energy and the data center. So beside the data center perspective, I also would like to share more about around another from another perspective to say the data center, because we are focused on the connectivity and the data center management business with CypressTel and like the SD-WAN, MPLS VPN, edge computing, and then so it's almost all kind of this business are also related to the very highly related to the data center business. So I saw the trend of the driving our economy in China is from the customer internet to the industrial internet. During the last 10 or 20 years, the consumer internet developed very well and impact every industry. Definitely our telecom and ICT companies are benefited from this trend. And we build data center, submarine cable, and develop the new technologies like SD-WAN, edge computing, and so on. And so how about the next 5 to 10 years? I think the industrial internet will be the main power to impact our economy. So that's we saw the trend, and follow this trend, we saw the opportunities in our industry. The business definitely it's edge computing and the data center and connectivity. Like regarding of the edge computing, we saw there more and more data center in China. More and more data center are built in the tier 3 and the tier 4, the cities like Guizhou, Zhongwei, and the very far from the central cities. So as this change of the data center location and edge computing will be welcome and popular to adopt by enterprise, by our customers, leaders in China. So because of the major corporate business and the customers, the branches and the office are located in the hot cities like Shenzhen, Beijing, Shanghai. And so edge computing will be deployed flexible, and edge data will be met the needs of the new business application with the extremely low latency. So that's I saw one of the opportunities for the edge computing. Another one is for the connectivity business, like our CypressTel focus on. Yeah. I saw that the change is obviously from MPLS VPN to SD-WAN within these 2 years. CypressTel is one of the major SD-WAN providers focusing in the Asia Pacific area. We saw the change is very fast and become common. So I predicted the SD-WAN implementation will be boom period in the next 2 years, I think. So that's the kind of the opportunities related to the whole industry. So no matter what kind of technologies and the service our company or the company provide, like edge computing, SD-WAN, SASE, and other service are related. All the service will be related to the data center, the whole infrastructure, and we need to deeply understand the data center, where the data located, and how we can design the full infrastructure for the customers. And we also need to fully understand the industrial real needs. Like take an example, like the automobile industry, and what the customer real need, where the data may be the data to put the data center in Guizhou, or some the application in the Shanghai or the different areas. So we need to fully understand both in the industry and also the data center business and SD-WAN, the new technology. So that's the opportunities and challenges we are facing in this area. Yeah. So back to James.
And what's interesting there, Connie, is I mean, you hit it right. You know, I mean, we've got a lot of regions and a lot of provinces within China, and it leads nicely onto, you know, the specific China angle that we mentioned at the start as we work through the story, which is around what's happening in the Beijing and Shanghai regulations. You know, so similar again to you know the moratorium that we're seeing here in Singapore. I'm based in Singapore, not in China. I didn't say that at the start, but I'll throw it in now. You know, it's that legislation change, which I think is also important, and what's happening around the PUE efficiency of data center design, and like you say, Dedric, you know, when did you actually measure that PUE? Is that a view of a 12-month period, or did you take it on the 24th of December in the middle of a Beijing or Tianjin winter? In which case, you know, your free cooling and your adiabatic cooling kicks in, and sort of everyone's happy. Oops. So I think the question is around, you know, what are we seeing in the regulations in Beijing? And also interesting, just bringing back in something that Susanna mentioned as well, which is the interactive atlas. So I assume, you know, you were talking that you're happy to give people a walkthrough of this if they contact you, but you know, using that to understand where you can build and design and deploy data centers in China. And then suddenly, as you're doing that outside of these main provinces, which are finding it harder to sign off on ESAs, which, if you're not aware on the call what an ESA is is basically your right to draw power from the state grid within a certain province. If you don't have an ESA, you can't sell that power. So it's absolutely critical that, you know, if you're talking or working with a partner, you make sure they have an ESA. Otherwise, those data centers are at risk of being shut down, which we are seeing across some of the regions. Maybe we'll come back to that. But what's your view? I mean, maybe Dedric, what are you seeing specifically around the legislation change for Beijing and Shanghai around sort of design and requirements that the government and the provincial governments are putting in place now?
It's a shift. The initial impact of the legislation was around new builds, right? And that sort of put pressure onto the operator and the builder operator to ensure that the design was compliant to meet certain energy efficiency standards, right? And those vary depending on where you were building, right? So in the core cities, it was more stringent, you know, in the tier 1 cities, and the Beijing, Shanghais, and the Guangzhous, right? You're looking at, you know, a below 1.4 kind of, right, requirement in design to be able to get the permit to build, right? But as we see a greater emphasis on sustainability being pushed through by the government, we're seeing the impact going on to those data centers that are already operating, right? Which means that 5-year-old, 8-year-old data centers are all using older technologies. They're due for a life cycle refresh in terms of their equipment. And they're thinking, oh, right, the impact now is not whether or not I have a permit to build, is that based on the performance of my data center, my electricity costs will be significantly higher due to tariffs, because I'm not being able to meet those energy efficiency objectives set by whether it's a local or a government or a federal government. Now, Beijing and Shanghai are the leaders in terms of this, but you'll see these regulations being copied and trickled out to the other hubs, right? You know, some places, and Connie, you mentioned Guizhou, Inner Mongolia is also a place. In Hebei, there's places in Zhangjiakou where they're having the Winter Olympic skiing events, are also, you know, focused areas where they're at the moment attracting companies and hyperscalers and the Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent to build their facilities. But what will happen is that because Beijing and Shanghai are taking the lead in terms of developing these legislations, once the investment has been attracted, then those energy efficiency requirements will probably roll into those second tier cities as well, right? So there's a little bit of angst in the market. And the angst is also about, how do I control this? If I didn't design my data center in a way that I can monitor and control how it performs, what do I do? What do I have to then invest in? And does that investment into the monitoring and the new infrastructure end up being a good investment based on how much I'll save in my energy consumption?
Yeah. Okay.
Right,
So,
there's
just one of your points. Yeah. To one of your points there. So Hebei you mentioned, right, and it's very attractive for a lot of hyperscalers. And just a quick answer, your opinion on this, because I want to go to Susanna and ask a question specifically around PUE and design in a moment. But Hebei, right? I mean, it's right at the top of the tree with regards to data center deployments in China, right? You know, millions and millions of tons of CO2 emissions and things within digital infrastructure. Do we believe, or do you feel that it's going to become harder and harder to get ESAs and get the permits to build new facilities within that province? And are we going to see a real drive to outlying provinces, as Connie mentioned, where there is less digital infrastructure and therefore easier for those provincial governments to take advantage of the requirements?
My experience has been that the provincial governments will eventually follow, right? In terms of the first tier cities leads, as well as the direction from the state government, right? And it's very, very clear. And this is the great thing about how the Chinese government manages this country. It's a little bit like managing a company, right? The 5-year plan is like a corporate 5-year plan. It's a policy, right? These are the objectives of the country as we move to 2025, right?
That's great.
There are priorities, right? Smart cities is a priority, right? Intelligent infrastructure is a priority. You know, all that is driven by data centers, but then they've put in energy efficiency as a priority, which means that the policies that are coming out, even for places like Hebei, which is right now, right, because of access to cheap energy or the right kind of climate, right, is attracting investment. What will happen is that as the rest of the country starts to advance towards achieving that energy, that sustainability goal, they'll have to follow suit, right?
Yeah.
So
look, I agree, Dedric, and I think, you know, certainly our experience and my experience of working for Chayora is actually it's the provincial governments that are really driving that sort of demand for and attraction, shall I say, for digital infrastructure in their provinces. So the likes of, you know, so those government relationships for operators such as ourselves are incredibly important, right? With regards to enabling the power, enabling the permits. And so that sort of relationship is important. And those provinces can drive, you know, support and structures around what power what charges they're going to put on the power for certain industries. So interesting there, where we'll see some of these provinces really being forced to reduce down the digital infstructure.
Right.
Well, not reduce down,
and access to renewables is also something you throw in.
Yeah, absolutely. But look, just you know, we've talked a little bit about PUE, and obviously we need to sort of meet these designs. And with your background, Susanna, you know, building up so many data centers around the world when you were with eBay. I'm just sort of keen, what are your views on what else we need to be doing in order to, you know, from a design perspective, because it's not just PUE. And as Dedric said, it's really about having optionality. So as data centers are starting to age and you're replacing infrastructure, how do you replace that infrastructure with the newest and latest technologies? You know, you talked a little bit around, I think it was, you know, building out facilities with fuel cells, lithium batteries. You know, what should we be doing as an industry?
Thank you for the opportunity to share my views. We all are familiar with usage effectiveness, and we tend to gravitate towards power.
Yeah.
But I would think that the resource usage effectiveness, from what I've actually seen now with my colleagues building the net zero data center, we are actually not as concerned with the power as we are more concerned about water, James, such as the water usage effectiveness. We look at it as a holistic life cycle. I'm actually a member of an organization also assisting in measurement to add the sustainability metrics to look at it from a life cycle perspective to take a departure from the linear economy. So we call that circulytics. So the circulytics basically is all tied back to sustainability, that how do we basically utilize the resources that we need in our design, in our build, and in our operation, and not to forget about when we actually have to bring down the data center at the end of life, or we need to combine certain data center in a zone, an availability zone concept. So we need to look at that from a holistic perspective throughout the entire life cycle. And one of the key aspects we also focus on, James, is actually the embedded carbon in the material that we use for data center. And the approach that we basically do in terms of doing data center when we build them. So we bias towards prefab material, prefab modular data center. So we don't have to do as much work as we have to generate that much emission during the build phase. And during the operation, we also have shifted to be more availability zone concept, similar to all of us now in different countries. We can always work as an availability zone. I'm sure your company are actually very good at that design, which is one of the reasons why you guys are so good as a best of breed provider for your client. So we don't have this concept of 2N or having a lot of standby and over provisioning. And by getting rid of over provisioning, by not having 2N data center, which I am certainly absolutely apologize for what I did by grabbing resources because I can. So I can actually have to stand by because I dare not to have user experience problem when we are growing so fast. And that is just wrong. We have to be more holistic about thinking about the community in terms of the energy or the water usage or the material that we use throughout the life cycle, and work on more the on-demand and capacity management, and be more socially conscious. Again, I'll go back to the word ethics, socially conscious that we have to harmonize with the community that we all lived in. And we cannot just grab resources and toss them out when we're done. So we really need to embrace circulytics in terms of measuring our own accountability, in terms of reuse and recycled, the waste and the emissions, so we can create the social benefits. And this is more than just per site, per rack, per instant in time of power usage effectiveness, because it's just a data point. We need to be more holistic in our thinking in terms of the whole entire life cycle, which are all industry standards. So we can actually be able to compare and we can improve upon each other. So that's why I think standard is very important. And I'm very active in leading a lot of clean energy standard, net zero design for cloud, colo, and edge computing.
Yeah. Okay. And so Connie, coming back to yourself, because I mean, again, it's an interesting point. I mean, that water usage efficiency is absolutely another data point. So in my opinion, right? I mean, it's looking at all of those elements and how you can manage those cooling systems to drive down all of those elements. But also, we should be responsible as operators, and also, you know, our customers should be responsible about how they procure and who they procure from. We need to be thinking about our supply chain. So I know that our teams run by Mark Feredic in Beijing is very conscious about ensuring that we work with a supply chain as far as we can, that is moving towards certain green targets and green credentials. So we're really sort of pushing that down the supply chain. And I think you mentioned circularity. It was that the phrase. So I'm assuming, shouldn't always assume, but that's very similar. I mean, some of the other elements I think we need to think about is that circular economy of how we can recycle even the infrastructure within a data center, right? So yeah, on that, I mean, Connie, again, sort of taking your perspective as the CEO of CypressTel, What's your sort of view on, I suppose, the supply chain and how you manage your sustainability for your own organization? Is that something that is a number one priority for you, or is it something that your customers would like to have, but they're not really willing to and again, I go back to the point, pay for it, because sometimes those options are not as commercially viable as just using coal. Let's be fair.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you, James, and thank you. As Susanna and Dedric also mentioned about the regulation and the energy social responsibility in the, so now we are as a company, we rise we're running the company and serve our customers for all the service, connectivity, data center, the service. Also, we are for the whole supply chain or the whole components. We also consider the recycle, how to use the energy and reduce the energy consumption, and it's all that we all use we use automatically for all the running, how to use the edge computing, and also all of the kind of the equipment or other service. We are considering how to provide the green energy service to our customers, and also we consider this, but it's how the customer to accept the new technology within the green concept. It's on the way. I think it's not how we can give the price or what kind of it's a lower price, and encourage the customers to use new technology to reduce energy consumption. So that's the way. We have the social responsibility to encourage the whole industry to bring us to the zero carbon and the targets. Yeah. So,
okay. Well, look, we're coming into the last few minutes. There's a question I'd just like to put to you, Dedric. Are you seeing in China, so this has come in, are you seeing in China a trend for PUE declarations by the Chinese operators to be vetted by third parties? So for example, the likes of CQC. So if you operate data centers in China, there's a number of, if you're on the call listening, there's a number of sort of organizations. CQC is one of the leading bodies. And certainly if you're in the financial services industry or serving the financial services industry, a lot of the time they look for CQC grade A, which, Susanna, to your point, also requires a 2N configuration at the moment. So Dedric, are you seeing any of that coming through?
I am seeing, and I think there's a need in the market, not necessarily a need, but there's a want in the market to understand how the standards like CQC compare to the global standards, like presented by Uptime or EPI or those types of organizations, how much they're similar and how much they're different. What are the distinctions between each of these levels of certification? But certainly this is a tool. This is a tool for them to communicate their performance. It's a tool to communicate to their customers and their market that we've taken the steps to try and to improve either the reliability or the efficiency of our data center. I think fundamentally though, their investment in terms of finding out how the data center's performance in various different aspects is also very important from a sort of a day-to-day operation or a month-to-month operation perspective, right? By understanding that, the operators then are able to tweak and control their data center operations in such a way that has not only an environmental impact, but also a general performance impact that's beyond simply certifying your data center and being able to communicate it. And that, I think, will become more and more important as people try to adopt more of a energy ethics standpoint.
Okay, all right. Well, look, we're just coming down to the last dying minute of our 50-minute chat, and it's been absolutely fantastic. But what I'd like to ask, Dedric, you had a little bit of talk there. One sound bite from both Connie and Susanna. What would you want people to take away from this 50 minutes where they've been listening to us sort of discuss these issues? So I'll come to you first, Susanna. Go, 10 seconds. What's that sound bite?
Embrace net zero design throughout your life cycle and measure your progress starting today onward, and take the journey together and share your results.
Perfect. And Connie?
Yeah, I think even the regulation delivery in China about data center, I think it's a delivery, the very clear direction and more transparent to how to invest in China for the data center business. I think it also is a good time for the investors. It's a positive for the investment.
I couldn't agree more. And on that perfect end, look, that's the end. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you all. That was a great session. Just reiterating James's point, that was fantastic. Thank you all.
Just got cut off, sorry.
Sorry. Thank you for joining. The session's going to be available on demand for 30 days. I would just like to thank Chayora again for bringing everyone together and making the event possible. Thank you all. I look forward to seeing you soon for our next session. Goodbye for now.